Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on how to supercharge your B2B digital engagement strategy. My name is Mario Kiriakou. I'm co-founder of Ratio, and I'm going to be your presenter for today. A few housekeeping rules before we get into the presentation. Today's session is being recorded, and I will send a copy of this in the next, probably by tomorrow, so you should get it by Friday. If you want a copy of the slides, happy to send that over as well. We should have some time for Q&A at the end. I would try not to take up too much of people's time today, so I'll try to keep it within under the hour. But if we have time for Q&A, we'll do that. We'll tackle that at the end. So if you have any questions, just drop those questions into the Q&A toolbar on the Zoom chat window, and I can rattle through those at the end of today's presentation. I'm just going to give a 15-second who is Ratio. I don't want to spend too much time on us because I know we're here for the presentation and not so much about Ratio, but just to give you an idea of who we are a digital and marketing technology agency based out of London in the United Kingdom. We've worked with a range of businesses over the last couple of years, mostly around understanding their audience's intent and building customer experiences around leveraging technology to deliver the type of designs and experiences that we're going to talk about during today's presentation. So what we're going to explore today, so a little bit of the agenda overview. We're going to discuss and explore some of the challenges in B2B around targeting customers and segments that matter. We're going to look at how you begin to identify individuals for one-to-one conversations. That's both for offline, but also how we can digitally treat individuals as design individual experiences based on individuals as opposed to mass marketing to multiple segments. We're going to discuss elements like optimal content journeys. We're going to look at how to provide business intelligence to your offline sales teams. We're going to explore things such as lead scoring, etc. So we've got quite a lot jam-packed in today's presentation. And to be honest with you, we could probably spend an hour talking about each of those elements on their own, but hopefully we'll manage to get through quite a lot today. So obviously today's topic is about digital engagement in B2B, and within B2B, it's something which is quite close to my heart. Spent a lot of years working in B2B, in marketing, and so my background also is in demand generation. Whenever you talk to to peers within B2B and marketers, etc., demand generation, lead generation is something that always comes top of mind, and it's there for a reason. Most marketers are heavily focused on driving that demand for their business. Their things like budgets, things like the amount of people who are allocated to demand generation and awareness tends to take up the majority of a marketing department's focus within B2B organizations. So it's something which gets a lot of airtime in conversations, but demand generation isn't the be all and end all. And hopefully at the end of today's presentation, I'll begin to give an idea of why, in my opinion, demand generation is super important to B2B, and it's not something which should go away, but why having such a top-heavy focus on driving top-of-funnel marketing does a disservice to your business's end goals. And we're going to discuss that in a second. So from my perspective, what do I mean by top-of-funnel marketing? Well, as I just said, I always feel like B2B organizations focus so heavily on driving that initial demand, getting people to engage with your campaigns, allocating media spend to drive inbound traffic, getting the numbers up for engagement to your digital assets, or engaging with your emails. But that's all well and good, and that's important. But the way I always look at it is such a heavy investment in driving that initial awareness piece, which could be perhaps 10, 15% of what you want to be doing. Look at the next stage. The idea is to try and pull people within your engagement orbit. And I've kind of got an image of a black hole because it reminded me of the film Interstellar, the idea being a black hole will pull everything around it into its orbit. And I like to think of digital engagement strategies as something similar. We spend so much time generating that awareness. The question to ask ourselves is, what percentage of that traffic or that engagement stays with us? Now, if we convert them on for example, a form completion, that gives us an opportunity to engage and nurture with them. But I'm going to talk about in a second why that is not necessarily the optimal way to engage with our audience. But what happens to everyone else who perhaps doesn't convert? We spend so much money pulling them in, get them to engage with our content, and unless we pull them into our orbit, it's in one sense a very expensive form of allocating our resources. So looking at this different way, what sort of challenges are we trying to solve? And these are something which have come up in timeless conversations over the last couple of years. We have, a high media spend, so we're allocating lots of money for digital acquisition. We're looking to drive lots of demand, but we're not necessarily feeling like we're generating the value that the business is expecting for that investment. There's a focus on acquisition, which isn't a bad thing, but ultimately within a B2B business, marketing is only there to help drive and support the offline sales teams. So, how does those two link together? Very difficult to put a hard value on marketing's ultimate contribution to sales. It's a cliche, but something which always comes up because there's a kernel of truth to it, is that sales and marketing feel very disconnected in how they are working. What do you do with your audience once they've initially engaged with you? And what does engagement look like beyond emails and events? So why do we need to talk about digital engagement? So from my perspective, digital engagement is the idea of designing an experience that keeps your prospects and existing customers within your orbit, engaged with you as a brand, interacting with your content, coming back time and time again. Because ultimately, the one thing which rings true for B2B organizations, irrelevant of the type of product or service that you sell, is that invariably you will have a longer sales cycle. People don't make immediate decisions. Invariably, that if you're driving a big campaign, only a small percentage of those individuals may be in the market for whatever product or service that you're providing. And the challenge always then is, if they are the right individual and the right organization, how do we keep them within our orbit so that we are top of mind, and that when they have a need, they come back to us? Because ultimately, the one thing which rings true for most businesses is that customers, especially within a B2B setting, have other options. They're not obliged to come back to you, and people move on to different organizations when they have that need. So the idea is, how do we keep them engaged so they remember us? Another part of this I was thinking about recently, and this has come up from conversations with lots of our customers that we work with, the idea of the big quarterly campaign. An awful lot of effort goes into big campaigns, big content ideas, lots of content is produced, tools are created, heavy spend is allocated, a lot of marketing goes out to the existing database and across various channels to drive demand for this big quarterly campaign, this big content-led campaign. And at the end of the quarter, we move on to the next campaign, and this content kind of then begins to sit somewhere on the website, and people may or may not discover it, which I always think is a shame, because the idea behind that content and those campaigns is something which potentially is resonating with at least part of your audience, depending on the diversity of the segments that you market to. But then what do you do with that content and campaigns afterwards? How can your customers interact with that campaign content when they actually have a need or requirement that resonates with those themes? And also, what happens once your audience engages or clicks on potentially quite an expensive link, if you're allocating money to things like LinkedIn advertising or social advertising, or things like Google? Those links, those CTAs, those clicks that people click on, potentially are costing you quite a lot of money. And what happens next? Is the goal just to get someone to complete a form? Well, that's fine, but then thinking beyond that journey of they completed the form and we passed on that data to sales, what do we want that individual's experience to look like with us as a brand on an ongoing basis? And for me, digital engagement has a very selfish motive as well. The idea is to drive up the ROI of your marketing investment. Quite often, marketing, especially in digital, the CTAs, or so the KPIs that sit around it, are linked to things like cost per acquisition, number of form completions, and those type of stats, which are great. But ultimately, we want to kind of stitch together from media spend all the way through to sales. It had a complete journey. So, and look at measuring ROI beyond just, cost per acquisition per lead. Looking at the cost per acquisition of marketing spend versus the volume of, say, opportunities or pipeline of sale that's created. So selfishly, we want to show that marketing is driving genuine business value for the company. And to do that, we want to build an environment that's built around your prospects, built around your existing customers, and it's built around them in a way that is set up to nurture your audience. Because we said at the beginning of the presentation, you are spending an awful lot of money to target your ideal individuals within accounts. And then the question is, what happens next? So we want to build a nurture environment to sit around those individuals and those accounts. And part of that is about reimagining what the funnel experience could look like for your audience. The example on the screen in front of you is a way of simplifying what in reality actually is a complex, I suppose, experience that we're looking to design for your customers. It's about trying to break down the traditional marketing funnel. And I appreciate the marketing funnel doesn't marry up with the reality of how prospects and customers engage with brands. A marketing funnel implies a nice, simple, linear journey. And the reality is customers are not that simplistic in the way they engage with you, jumping through hoops from A to B to C, that they will do research, they will speak to different people. It's a non-linear journey. But the idea around reimagining the nurture experience is to look at the moments of digital impact that customers and prospects have with you as an organization. So these are the moments where there's an opportunity for them to interact with you, whether that's clicking a email, whether that's engaging with a offline salesperson or a customer success individual, whether that's coming back to the site to look at content around products or services or campaigns. These are moments and opportunities where your customers are colliding with you as a brand digitally. And these are moments where I like to think of, if you're looking to reimagine the nurture funnel, this is what the nurture funnel looks like in terms of, an idealized digital engagement strategy, those moments of impact. And it could be a few of these, it could be dozens, there could be hundreds of these, spread over, months to years, depending on the type of sales cycles that you traditionally have. And we're going to talk about, as we progress during today's presentation, how we can begin to tag, profile, capture, and recognize these individuals so that we can understand, who they are, what they are, and potentially what they want from us in terms of an experience, in terms of optimizing content, copy, etc. So what does digital engagement look like? So I've got a young child who's been playing around with pirate toys recently. So this is something that came up when I was thinking about, when I was writing this presentation, which is, let's follow this spot on the map X. So the way I like to look at it is that when you speak to B2B marketers, it can be quite daunting when you're looking to, I suppose, design the ultimate digital engagement, nurture experience, because in one sense, it's easier to focus on that initial awareness piece because it feels a lot simpler. And it can feel quite daunting when looking to approach this type of challenge or this type of project. So I always say, let's start with where we want to get to and work our way backwards from that. And it becomes simpler looking at that. So in terms of designing that sort of digital engagement strategy, I like to bear in mind, two core audiences. One is obvious, and one, when you discuss this with marketers, feels less obvious and something which doesn't necessarily come up on a regular basis, but something which I think is important. One is thinking about your customers. And this is something which undoubtedly you will do. You will, I'm sure, have a good handle on who your target audience is. I'm sure you've worked with, internally or with research businesses, create personas and detailed frameworks telling you, who your different audience segments are, the type of individuals, what roles they have within certain types of accounts, perhaps even the named accounts you want to be targeting. So I'm sure you have a good idea of, who they are, what they want, and perhaps their day-to-day challenges. The other part, which is less obvious, is you may call them different things within organizations, but typically, your sales teams, your client teams, your customer success teams, your relationship managers, the teams tasked with ultimately taking the opportunities which marketing kind of set up for offline sales teams, and are tasked with nurturing, building pipeline, closing, and building those relationships over many years, so they're profitable and repeat customers. And we're going to talk about sales in a little bit more detail on what we mean about understanding their needs shortly. But before I do, I just wanted to just break down sort of the core building blocks that we have, as an agency, from years of working with different types of customers, have kind of built up as our framework of trying to distill what a digital engagement strategy includes. As I mentioned before, understanding your audience is key. And again, this is something which isn't rocket science. It's something I'm sure everyone on today's call is completely aware of and got a handle on. But my perspective, to add something new, if it is new, is to think about not just the roles and individuals, but to try and think about it from the perspective of their day-to-day roles. What do those individuals have as daily challenges? What are they trying to solve on a weekly basis? And how can you as a business, I suppose, jump into those conversations, jump into solving some of their day-to-day challenges, which may be slightly abstracted from your core product, but probably not. The second part is, most organizations focus on creating, really wonderful personas, creating all this stuff offline. You have workshops, you create, post-it note sessions on the walls, where you detail everything about your customers. The challenge then is, how do you translate that digitally? A lot of that persona content mapping work does have value. Invariably, it forms part of, for example, if you take a corporate website, I'm sure it forms part of creating the content that sits on that website, and it may even influence the campaigns or content you create subsequently. But the bigger challenge I always find is, if you was to ask a marketer within a B2B organization, if you're able to identify, match up individual visits or the individual people engaging with their content at any given time of the day or month, what profile or segment persona they sit within, it's very difficult. So the second part is having the data and audience profiling in place so that you can begin to identify the segments which you've identified offline but digitally. And the reason why that's important is because the third part of what we see as a sort of key foundational building block is, once we have that profiling in place, it means we can begin to recognize prospect intent. If we have that profiling in place, we can begin to track and understand across different channels the type of things which are top of mind. Are they researching certain products or services that you have? Are they looking at certain tools? Are they researching certain white papers or content that you're producing? The reason that's important is because that begins to give us clues and indications of what sits behind that, I suppose, what prompted them to do that initial engagement with you, what prompted them to come back to you and research and look at something. And that's important because we discuss that shortly. The other one, which I alluded to before, is a couple of slides previously, is aligning KPIs with what matters, which from my perspective is closing the loop between marketing, what marketing does, how marketing spends its money, and what the business ultimately considers as something which is super important, which is the bottom line, generating pipeline, generating opportunities, upselling to existing customers. So designing KPIs which kind of which are pulled through from what marketing does and what sales produces. Then we can begin to think about the unified experience design. So the slide I had a couple of slides earlier about trying to reimagine the nurture journey. Once we have the sort of foundational building blocks in place, we can begin to think about what type of engagement experience we want in place for those different audience segments, the type of content that we want to surface, the type of copy that should be front of mind, the different types of CTAs, the type of joined up experience we might want across different channels such as website or email. And the final part is, marketing is always tasked with helping the offline part of the business, the sales function to drive more business. So another part of this is understanding how we can help sales and business development and client success functions, how we can provide them with intelligence around prospects and existing customers to help them do their roles much better. So part of this is about creating content journeys that truly engage. Now, I like to think that when thinking through this problem, and around content journeys that truly engage, I always like to go back to the offline experience that an existing customer might potentially have with your organization, and try to understand what does that experience look like. The good thing about B2B is that invariably we're trying to build long-term relationships with our customers and with our clients. And that means we get to know and we get to understand their challenges. And once we understand them, we can begin to better service them, provide them with product recommendations, and to generally trying to be as useful and helpful as possible. And in terms of content and digital experience, from my perspective, that's something which we want to replicate online. So the type of experience they have with you offline is something more to deliver online. But the challenge is, how can we begin to approach that? How can we digitize the offline relationship? It's very easy to say, and the reality is it's quite hard. But it's hard when we think about it quite abstractly. And hopefully at the end of today's presentation, you see that the idea is to dive into each of these different building blocks and tackle those individually. With the idea being it will lead you on a sort of a journey towards a greater digital maturity, towards the type of engagement strategy you have in place. In terms of starting places, I always like to think of the CRM. So within B2B, the CRM is typically the record of truth for sales, for managing pipeline, managing customer interactions. That's the source of truth. The business will dip into the CRM in order to forecast, pipeline and sales for the quarter ahead. That's what they use. But from a marketing digital perspective, we need something similar. We need a digital record of truth for marketing. Well, what do we mean by that? And the best way to visualize this, and there's different tools and different ways of going about this, but the CRM analogy for me is always the best way to describe this, because it's exactly the same thing. We want to create a digital CRM for marketing. The idea being we have individual CRM contact records, account records. It's the same thing for digital. That begins to capture everything we know about a customer, a prospect, what we know about them, how they're interacting with us, what content they're engaging with, what content they're viewing, what is top of mind. If they're a known visitor because they're converted on the form, who they are, their name, their email. If they're an unknown visitor, that's just as important, because invariably, if we're spending a lot of effort with creating awareness, driving traffic to our digital channels, only a small percentage of that traffic is ever going to convert. The question is, what do we do with the remaining, say, for example, 95% of that traffic, which remains unknown? And I suppose a way to determine if this is important to you is, after this course, to have a look at, if you use things like Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics, have a look at the percentage of returning visitors that you have as a business, and that will give you an idea of the volume of people who are repeatedly coming back to you. And the question is, okay, do we have known details on them? If we don't, that's fine. We can still deliver something to them based on the information we're capturing. So we talked about understanding and building something around the client's perspective, the customer's perspective. And I mentioned before designing an engagement strategy around the needs of sales teams. So I just want to spend a little bit of time just exploring that in a little bit more detail. And some of the things we want to talk about is how do we extract the business intelligence that sales needs? I think it's always a good exercise to go to your sales generating function and ask them what would they ideally love to know about their prospects or existing customers to help them sell more. Invariably, they'll give you a list of, say, 20 or 30 things they would love to see in a web form, which obviously is like the form of death, which we obviously don't want to do. We don't want to create a web form with 20 different form fields, which I'm sure sales would love to have that information on, but it's not necessarily something which provides value to to your audience. That being said, it's a good exercise because it gives us an idea of the type of data points and information points that sales require or need and would love to have. And we can begin to think about how we can extract that type of intelligence on prospects, different from using different tools and different ways of approaching it. So a slightly misleading question, is a form completion a lead? And obviously the short answer is yes, it is. I mean, of course it is. But as I alluded to before, we don't just want to create a form lead and then hand it over to sales and kind of like, job done, we can move on. We want to understand how we can then complement the data that we've captured with additional data points on your audience, on your prospects, to help sales, not just sell, but also to in part impress customers in terms of us having greater insight into what they want. So a great way I always see this is to look at or to ask sales the type of questions they would ask prospects over the phone or face to face, around their challenges, etc. Because that gives us a great insight into the type of content perhaps that we want to create. Because if we can create the type of content that mirrors those offline, what's your challenge, Mr. Customer type questions, it gives us an idea of if we can create that content, if prospects begin to interact with that content, that kind of helps answer those offline questions before we've even had a face-to-face conversation. The other part is around lead scoring, helping sales to prioritize their efforts. If you're an organization which is generating, I suppose, good demand in terms of, the number of inquiries, etc., then how can you help your sales functions be more efficient? I would love to talk more about lead scoring because it's a whole topic on itself. But I suppose the main takeaway I'd like to leave everyone with of today's session is not to consider lead scoring as an isolated activity, is to treat lead scoring as another KPI, another reporting metric, another way of figuring out how to drive greater ROI from your marketing spend, but also building it into your engagement plans from day one. When you're designing that engagement experience, building how we want to profile that audience, I think is important because it feeds back into how do we better serve the sales function. And the idea is we want to build a flow of prospects and intelligence that will mirror the type of behavior your sales teams have offline. In my perspective, if we can begin to do that, it's not something we can achieve overnight, but if we can begin to move towards there, it shows a high regard for your prospects because it means we made a strong effort to really understand their needs and requirements from them as individuals and them as businesses. And how do we go about this? Part of this is almost building a digital detective type model. We talked about in the foundational building blocks, profiling your audience, having the data in place, having this a single source of truth for digital, which mirrors the type of CRM type experience that happens offline. And this gives us an opportunity to create, to be almost like a digital detective. We can then extract those data points, pull them into, we can start off quite simply with things like Excel sheets. We can then become more advanced by putting them into live dashboards that could then trigger emails and reports to our sales functions or sales directors. But once we have that profiling in place, we can begin to serve and service that information directly to the audience who needs it most, which is the people tasked with helping the business to drive the bottom line, day in, day out. I just want to talk about one of our existing customers that we are really proud of here at Ratio. We worked with on a number of years. So they're called Capco. They're a global financial services consultancy. And they had a similar problem in the sense that they produce an awful lot of content. They have a diverse audience base, so different types of accounts, different types of individuals, different types of roles and stakeholders they're looking to market to, create content for. They have a global sales force. They have different types of marketing technologies in place, and they want to be far more targeted in terms of their marketing, but they want to support and help sales to be far more successful. And the way they approached this was analyzing the technologies they have in place. In this instance, they had tools such as Sitecore powering their content management system, which gave them tools such as personalization, huge data collecting opportunities. They had HubSpot as their single source of digital truth, so that single data record. And they had other tools such as Octopus for things like social advocacy to maximize and amplify their marketing message. And the way we approached this with them was to look at what type of experience they want to deliver for their audience. So first, we took a step back. We looked at a lead scoring model. We looked at the type of content that is relevant for different segments and experiences, and began to create personalization models aligned with lead scoring models, because what they wanted to do was they wanted to nurture their prospects throughout the marketing funnel. So part of this was integrating HubSpot and Sitecore as a CRM and the CMS platform, with the idea being we can begin to profile and understand when a prospect re-engage with them as a brand, understand where they sat in the pipeline, in the nurture funnel. So for example, were they having a offline conversation? What was that conversation about? Was it about a certain service that they provided? Once they were able to profile that, then we could begin to look to personalize the on-site experience based on that offline conversation. So very targeted, very powerful, and something which I know that the team at Recapco was super proud of, because it's not something which happened overnight. It took a lot of work and a lot of time. The other part of this was building a lead scoring model which sat behind that hyper-targeted experience they were delivering to prospects across, in this instance, email and website. So they could begin to prioritize their efforts. So when prospects re-engaged with them as a brand, they can begin to profile the type of content they looked at and begin to surface up that data intelligence and put it into the hands of the individuals tasked with trying to win more business, if they're from an existing client, servicing better as well. As I mentioned before, once we have, and the slide in front of you, I think I always think is quite a good way of visualizing this. It's just showing an example of a single channel, in this instance, the website, a corporate website. But obviously, this could apply to your different channels, such as email as well. But the idea being, once we could begin to tag and profile and capture information of what channels, what content campaigns that brought them into your orbit, then how they've engaged with you, for example, on your website, what services they've dived into, that is the data which can be surfaced relatively easy and put into the hands of different teams. I haven't talked too much today about technology, because I always feel technology is super important, but sometimes its importance can be overplayed. From our perspective, you need to think about how you want to approach this, your strategy, what type of experience you want to deliver, and that's kind of more important. And technology is the great enabler. Sometimes technology can be seen as once we have the right tools in place, it will deliver everything. The reality is that most technology is a driverless car. It needs to be told what to do and how to do and where to go. I never recommend that if you're looking to try and do this yourselves, that you should just go out and buy a bunch of cool whiz-bang new marketing technology tools to bring into your tech stack. I always say the first step should be to look at what you have in place. Have a look at your current marketing technology stack. Have a look at its capabilities and how those capabilities match up against the type of omni-channel strategy and digital experience we want to put in place. So a simple way to approach this is to map out the tools you have, and well, as the screen says, really, it's as simple as that, really. It's to demystify the capabilities of each of those tools, because the reality is most organizations will only use 5, 10, 15% of the capability of the tools they have in place. Sometimes not aware of what is the capability they have in place because it's been bought by a different team or different stakeholders now left the business. So I always recommend either reaching out to that technology vendors customer success representative, or whoever's in that business who can help you figure out what that tool could be. It could be your agency, it could be the vendor, but figuring out what they can do. So what are the capabilities within each of those tools, and how that potentially can marry up with an experience. So we're not interested in just writing out a list of capabilities. We want to understand what experiences those tools can create, and actually how they can potentially begin to work together. Another thing that holds people back is they go, whoa, there's so much we could do. I don't know where to start. And people always ask, what is a simple way to approach this? And so I always think analyzing your existing technology stack is a great way, because if it can give you ideas of what you can do, basically, hopefully now, or with minimal development work or minimal spend, and then begin to build out simple use cases based on the capabilities of the stack that you have in place. So, I mean, the example on screen is pure an example, and I tried to look at the different technologies that everyone on the course got in place, and obviously it's very varied. But you can begin to build out use cases. Once you've demystified the capabilities, you can begin to build out use cases of what you can do and what type of experiences you begin to deliver. And I still always say it's worthwhile taking a step back and designing the overall experience, and then looking at almost like a POC of what you have in place, what you can deliver. Even if it's not necessarily where you want to be, it's a step in the right direction. Well, that brings us to the end of today's presentation. I hope you found it useful. As I said, today's session is recorded, and everyone will get a link in the next day or so. If anyone has any questions, my email, admittedly is quite long, is up on the screen, but I think most people will probably get an email from me with the link anyway. So if it's easier, feel free to reply to that. Let's have a quick look if there's any questions which have come in. Okie dokie. Okay, doesn't look like there's been any questions so far. Again, if anyone has anything to think of after today's call, more than happy to spend some time, thinking through an answer, and either writing a detailed answer, or if it's simpler, just jumping on a quick 5-minute call and just running through it. So thank you very much for joining me today. I always appreciate when people take time out their days to join these sessions. I know we're zoomed up at the moment. So again, thank you. And I hope you enjoyed the session. Hope to see you on the next one.